So now that we've seen the basic rules of critical squares, let's take a look at this position that I reached against a master named George Umezinwa in the Manhattan Chess Club in New York, the winter of 1994. I've been defending a worse position. I'm black. What should I do? Now obviously the critical question is whether or not I can play rook takes g6 and trade off into the king and pawn endgame. It's very important to know the theory of certain endgames in order to be able to evaluate correctly the simplification of positions. And usually in defense, if you can simplify into a drawn endgame, then you do that, because you can force the draw without having to defend anymore. So how do you evaluate this position? Rook takes g6. What do you think? Well, with our knowledge of critical squares, we should be able to see the correct variation. Take a few moments and think about this. What do you think? In fact, the position is drawn, because white can't occupy his critical squares. The variation runs rook takes g6, h takes g6, king f6. I'm attacking white's pawn. I'm sure you calculated that out. White has to defend it with king h5. Now I play king g7. This was the very beginning of the calculation. Now obviously, if white's king moves back, then black will simply take the pawn, and it'll be a draw. So white has to play the move g5. Black plays h takes g5, king takes g5. And now, if you didn't know about the critical squares, you might have had a hard time evaluating this position. But we know that white needs to occupy the g6 square with his own king, and he needs the pawn to be on g5 for it to be winning. Now black simply plays king g8, and after king f6, king f8. It's a draw. g7, king g8, king g6, stalemate. Now, notice, of course, in this position, it would be a terrible mistake to play either king f8 or king h8. After king f8, king f6, king g8, now white wins, g7. King h7, king f7. So the key to evaluating this position was both an understanding of opposition and an understanding of the critical squares. This is a nice simple example of how knowledge of the endgame will help you make good evaluations in long calculations.